Alright, this is my favorite part of this course because we're going to build a new feature end to end. So I'm going to show you a systematic approach to build any features or an entire application end to end. As part of this section, we'll add the ability to record rentals. So we're going to build this page where the user can look up a customer and the movies they're going to rent like this. When they submit the form, we'll display this toast notification and clear the form so they can add more rentals. This section is packed with lots of techniques, but before we get started, I want you to give me a promise. I want you to watch this only if you can set aside 1 hour of your time with full concentration. I don't want you to watch this section over 2 days or so, because the approach you're going to learn in this section will have a significant impact in how you build software in the future. So, are you going to promise to set aside 1 hour with full concentration? I hope you do, so let's get started. Okay, the first step to build software is understanding what problem you're trying to solve. A lot of developers spend hours, days, weeks, or even months of coding without knowing exactly what problem they're solving. So let's simulate a real-world scenario. We want to extend Vidly and add the ability to record rentals. Now, before starting to code, we need to understand exactly how this use case works. So we need to talk to our client or whoever we're building this application for and ask them questions to better understand this use case. Now, let's imagine I've gone through this exercise and I've figured out that as part of this use case, the customer comes to the counter and gives the movies to the staff member. The staff member identifies the customer by looking them up in the application and then adds each movie in the list of movies the customer is going to rent. And that's the end of this transaction. Okay, now to implement this, we have a few options. We can start from the front end or the back end, and there's no right or wrong here. Both approaches work and it's a matter of personal preference. But I personally think it's better to start from the back end because when you start from the front end, you might end up coming up with a complex user interface, and this complexity can leak into your backend design. So you end up over-engineering. But when you start from the backend, you don't care how the UI is going to look like. You focus on the input and output of the application. What is the input here? The ID of the customer and the movies they're going to rent. How we get these IDs is irrelevant. We may look up the customer by their name, their phone, driving license, or whatever. These are the details that can come later. Think of a building. When a construction team builds a building, they don't start with the windows or PowerPoints. They start with the structure, the skeleton. Where PowerPoints and windows will be placed, the type of glass used in the windows, the shower, the bathtub, these are all details that can come later. They don't change the big picture. Building software is the same. As a software engineer, you should focus on the big picture first. So for our new rental use case, the inputs to our application are customer ID and movie IDs. What about the output? In most cases, in video rental stores, as far as I know, there is no output. A video rental store is not like an order processing system where we give the customer an order or a transaction ID. So for now, we're just going to assume that we don't have an output unless something changes later on. So on the back end, we need an action that our front end is going to call later on. Now we can put this action in an MVC controller or an API controller. Now just for your information, saying MVC controller is probably not a good way to label this type of controller because MVC itself stands for Model View Controller. But we don't really have a proper term here, so let's just stick with MVC controller for discussion's sake. Now should we add this action in an MVC or API controller? It depends on what you want to return to the client once the form is submitted. If you want to return markup, go for an MVC controller. Otherwise, if you want to return data and generate markup on the client, go for an API controller. Now, in our application, when the user submits the form, we're going to use JavaScript on the client to clear the form and also display a toast notification. So we don't need any markup from the server, and it's better to put this action in an API controller. This also has another advantage. Potentially, we can build different types of clients in front of this API. We can build a mobile or a tablet app or a single page application using a framework like Angular, React, Ember, and etc. Now here is an exercise for you. You know the input and output of this use case. So go ahead and create a simple API that the front end will call when the user submits the form. This API is the public interface or the public contract of our application that is visible to the front end. What is happening behind this contract is implementation detail, and front end doesn't care about it. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, don't worry about the implementation of the API. Just create the action with the right input and output. Leave the implementation empty or just return a simple response. Okay, here's what I have done. I've created a new API controller called New Rentals Controller. And here we have one action that takes a new rental DTO. So this is the input into our application. In this DTO, we have two properties: customer ID, which is an integer, and movie IDs, which is a list of integer. So pretty simple. Now back in our API, note that I have decorated this action with HTTP post attribute. Because here we'll be creating new objects, so to comply with RESTful conventions, we should use HTTP post here. Now to implement this API, we need to look at our domain model first. Does our domain model currently support rentals? No, we don't have anything here that describes a rental. So we need to do a bit of domain modeling. What you see here is a simple UML class diagram. UML stands for Unified Modeling Language, and it's a great visual language for communicating with others. Now, in case you're a bit familiar with UML, I need to clarify something here. We're going to use UML only for better understanding of the problem domain. We're not going to create all kinds of diagrams as documentation. This is just waste of time, because the ultimate documentation is the code. Now look at this diagram. A customer can rent many movies, and a movie can be rented by many customers. So we need a many-to-many association between these two classes. Now here's the interesting part. The association itself needs attributes. So when a customer rents a movie, we need to know when they rented that movie and when they returned it. In UML, when an association requires attributes, we use what we call an association class. So here, rental is an association class. In terms of naming, we name an association class based on the association. Here we have customer rents movies, so we can call this association class rental. Now, in terms of implementation, this is actually pretty easy. Our rental class should have these properties you see here, as well as two navigation properties: customer and movie. It also needs an ID, and this is a requirement by Entity Framework, so it can create the primary key in the corresponding table. So here's your next exercise. I want you to add the rental class to our domain model and use a code-first migration to bring the database up to date. In the next lecture, we'll review my code. Okay, here's my rental class. We have ID, customer, movie, which are both marked as required. We also have date rented and date returned. Note that date returned is a nullable date time. So I added this class, and also in application DB context, added a DB set of rental, and then created a migration and updated the database. Okay, what's next? We are ready to implement our API. When it comes to implementation, it's best to start with the happy path. Forget about all edge cases and validation stuff at the beginning, because you can easily get distracted and get stuck in an endless loop. So focus on the happy path at the beginning, and I promise you'll be on the right track. So here, in this action, we need to load the customer and the movies based on the IDs that our DTO gives us. And then for each movie, we need to create a new rental object for that movie and the given customer, and then add it to the database. And that's your next exercise. So go ahead and implement the simplest API. Focus on the happy path. Imagine all IDs are valid. Once you implement the API, use Postman to call it. And make sure if you give it 3 movie IDs, you will get 3 rental records in the database. Okay, here's my implementation. First, we get the customer from the context. And note that I'm using the single method, not single or default. Because I'm assuming the client should be sending us the right customer ID, because the staff member will select this customer ID from a pick list or something. If a malicious user wants to send us invalid customer IDs, this line would throw an exception, and the malicious user will get a vague internal server error in the response. If you're building a public API that can be used by various applications, that's a different story. Then you would use single or default, like this, and check if customer is null, return bad request, and explain the reason for this error, invalid customer ID. But this API is not an external API. It's for internal use. So writing this additional code does not give us any value. It's just extra code to maintain. So I would rather to revert this back to the single method. Now similarly, we get the movies from the context. And note that I'm using a technique here to load multiple movies. So we have M goes to. Now instead of starting my comparison expression with M, I use new rental.movieIDs.contains and then pass m.id here. This will translate to a SQL statement like this. Okay, so we get the movies, then we iterate over them, and for each movie, we create a rental object. We set the customer, movie, and date rented. We add it to the context, and finally, we save the changes. Now for now, I'm just returning an OK response. The reason I didn't call the created method is because in this action, we are not creating a single new object. And when using the created method, we need to supply the URL to the newly created resource. But in this case, we have multiple resources. So here's the simplest implementation and our happy path. Now we need to add the details. So as part of our rental process, we need to take into account the availability of a movie. Does our domain model currently give us the ability to keep track of the availability of a movie? It does, because in our movie class, we have this property, number in stock, and we also have the rentals for that movie. So availability equals number in stock minus active rentals. By active rental, I mean rentals that don't have a return date. Now, while this certainly works, I see a problem here. If we want to give a report to the user to see the movies that are not available, for each movie, we have to look up our rentals table to calculate how many active rentals we have for that movie. And as the data in our rentals table grows, we're going to see performance degradation. So I want to propose a different solution. But hang on a sec, is this premature optimization? Not at all. I know that as the data in our application grows, finding the unavailable movies is going to get more costly. It's obvious. We don't need any profiling here. And also, I told you about the importance of our database schema and queries. So let's take a look at an alternative solution and then we come back to premature optimization again. What if we add a new property to our movie class called number available? So initially it's the same as number in stock. And when a customer rents that movie, we decrease it by 1. And subsequently, when the customer returns that movie, we'll increase it by 1. This way, we can quickly find all movies that are available or not available, and our queries will be less costly and also simpler. So I'm not going to sacrifice the maintainability of our application for premature optimization. With this solution, I will improve the maintainability of our application and optimize its performance at the same time. Premature optimization happens when you mess up with the code structure and make it unmaintainable for the sake of improving performance. But in this case, we're not going to do that. In fact, quite the opposite. We're improving the maintainability because our queries will be simpler and faster and less load on the database, which is extremely important when it comes to performance. So here's your exercise. I want you to make the necessary changes in our API to update availability for each rented movie. So as a quick tip, you need to add this new property to our domain model, update the database, and then modify the logic in our action. We'll review my code in the next lecture. So basically, I added this number available property in the movie class, and then created a migration. I modified this migration by adding this SQL method here. And this is required to initialize this number available column. And finally, I modified the API by adding this line in the for each block. So pretty simple. We're done with the happy path. Now let's think of the edge cases. What are possible edge cases here? We have 4 edge cases. Customer ID is invalid. We don't have any movies in our DTO, so the list is empty. 1 or more movie IDs are invalid. And finally, 1 or more movies are not available. Now I'm going to explore these edge cases with 2 points of view, defensive and optimistic. And there's really no right or wrong here, because it's not black or white. Different developers have different points of view, and I want you to see both views in this lecture. So let's start with the defensive view. First edge case, customer is not valid. So we should explicitly handle this scenario, which means we should change this single to single or default, and then check if customer is null, return bad request. Customer ID is not valid. Next edge case, we don't have any movies in the DTO. So if new rental.movies.count is 0, return bad request. No movie IDs have been given. And potentially we could move this up, because if we don't have any movies in this DTO, we don't want to query the database to get the customer. Next edge case, 1 or more movies are invalid. So once we get the movies from the database, we do a check like this. If movies.count, now I just realized that I forgot to apply toList here, because previously our movies object was an iQueryable object, but I'm looking for a list. Now we get the count of these movies, and if they're not equal to count of movies in our DTO, that means 1 or more of the movies were not loaded. Again, return bad request. 1 or more movie IDs are invalid. And the fourth edge case, a movie is not available. So in our for each block, if movie.number available is 0, return bad request. Movie is not available. Now we could also add the ID of the movie, but let's not worry about it for now. So this is the defensive approach. I personally would choose this if I'm building a public API that can be used by different applications and different teams. So we do a lot of validation and return errors explicitly. Now we can see with this approach, we have added a number of conditional statements in our method, and in my opinion, this is creating pollution and noise in the code. Next time a developer joins our team and looks at this code, they're like, what's happening here? Too much noise. Now, as I said, if you're building a public API, that's a different story. So that's the extra cost you're paying for making your API return explicit error messages. But in this case, this API is not a public API. It's purely there so that the front end can call it. So I personally don't like to pollute my code with all this kind of conditional statements. So let's go through these edge cases using the optimistic approach. For the customer, I'm going to go back to the single method. And then we don't need this if block here. For the movies, I'm not going to do this extra check here on the top. And the next one here. But the availability of the movie is an interesting edge case. Even if we assume that the client is sending us movies that are available, it's possible that a hacker calls this API 100 times for a valid movie, and this movie will eventually become unavailable. And this property, number available, will end up being negative. And this should never, ever, ever happen, because it can totally mess up with future calculations. So I want to explicitly check for this, mainly to prevent a malicious user from messing up with our application. For the other edge cases, the current implementation does protect our application, so we don't need any extra code. So I showed you two different ways of handling edge cases, and it's really up to you which approach you prefer. Just remember, with the defensive approach, you pollute your code with a lot of validation checks, which are not always required. So these extra lines of code can make your maintenance and future development more costly. And that's why I personally prefer to use defensive programming when I really have to. All right, our API is ready. Next, we're going to start working on the front end. Okay, now it's time to build the front end. In this section, I'm going to show you a different way to build forms. So earlier, to add a customer, we built a form like this. So we used the helper method like html.beginForm, label for, text box for, and so on. In this kind of form, when the user clicks the submit button, they have to wait for the server to respond. And quite often, the browser goes blank for a second or two, if not more, until the server responds. Now, there is a different way to post data to the server, which creates a faster and smoother user experience. We use AJAX, which means instead of posting data using a traditional HTML form, we call the server asynchronously in the background. And this way, the page doesn't flicker until the server responds. So in this section, we're going to use AJAX to call our new rental API. If you're new to the concept of AJAX, read the PDF I've attached to this lecture. Now, let's build a very basic form for renting movies. In Solution Explorer, right-click Controllers, and add a new controller. We set this to an MVC5 controller and call it Rentals Controller. Next, we rename this action to New. We're going to use this to return the form to the client. So let's create the view. With ReSharper, it's pretty easy. We put the cursor here, Alt and Enter, and Enter, and Enter. We can set the title to New Rental Form. Now, we don't really need to set the layout here because there is a default value for it. So let me delete this line and show you where that default value is set. So in Solution Explorer, go to Views, underline View Start. What we have here will be placed on top of all views. So we can see the layout is set and we don't have to specify it in every view. Now let's close this. So to create a form, we are not going to use html.beginForm because that would create a traditional HTML form. Instead, I'm just going to use raw HTML. Like this. Now with traditional HTML forms, we set the action here. This action specifies the endpoint that this form will be posted to. So when we use html.beginForm and specify an action and controller here, this method would get the URL for that action and put it here. Like this. But again, as I said, we're not going to use this action attribute. Now, in case you have some familiarity with the MVC, we also have a helper method called ajax.beginForm. But this helper method is designed to call actions in MVC controllers, not API controllers. If you want to call an action in a web API, the syntax gets really ugly. And that's why I prefer to use raw HTML. Okay, now let me show you a cool technique to quickly create markup. We call this Zen coding. So in this form, I want to have a div with the class form-group. Inside this div, I want to have a label. And next to this label, I want to have an input with the attribute type set to text. And I want this input to have the class form-control. Now press Tab, and we get this markup. So if you have installed Web Essentials plugin that I told you at the beginning of the course, you get this feature, which is called Zen coding. So let's set the label here, customer. Let's repeat one more time. I want a div with the class form-group. So this is CSS syntax. we use CSS syntax to generate HTML markup. Inside this div, I want to have a label. And next to this label, I want to have an input with the type attribute set to text. And I want this input to have the class form-control. Tab. This label is going to be movie. And finally, I want to have a button with two classes, btn and btn-primary. And let's just call this submit. Let's test our form. Control F5. Okay, we have customer and movie. Now later, we're going to add auto-completion to these text boxes. Before I finish this lecture, let's put a link to this form on our navigation bar. With ReSharper, you can quickly find a file using Control, Shift, and N. If this doesn't work on your machine, it's because you're using a different keyboard scheme. It's one of the settings of ReSharper. So you need to press Control, Shift, T. Let's go to this file. Underline navbar. We created this partial view earlier in the course, and as you can see, it's stored in views/shared. So if you're not using ReSharper, you need to manually open this file. Okay, now I'm going to put a new link here. HTML.action link, new rental, which points to the new action in rentals controller. Okay, to add auto-completion to these text boxes, we're going to use a jQuery plugin called Type Ahead, which is developed by the Twitter team. So open up Package Manager console and install package twitter.typeahead. Now we go to our bundle config and add the type ahead script in our lib bundle. So scripts typeahead.bundle.js. Next, we need to borrow some styles from TypeAhead website because this NuGet package only contains the scripts and no style sheets. So open up Google and search for typeahead.js. And then go to the examples page. So look, this is the kind of look and feel I would like to have in our application. So right-click somewhere, view page source. You see example.css. Let's have a look. So here we have a bunch of generic styles, which we are not interested in. Scroll down until you see this declaration. Typeahead class, tt-query, and tt-hint. Now we're not going to copy these particular classes, so scroll down a bit more. From the next class where you see this one, typeahead with background color set to FFF. So copy from here all the way up to here. Copy. Now back in Visual Studio, let's go to the content folder and add a new style sheet. We call this typeahead.css. Paste the styles, save. Now back to the bundle. We should add the CSS to our CSS bundle. So content/typeahead.css. So this is all the plumbing work we have to do. Now we need to use the plugin. One more time, back to the examples page. Click on this link, remote. This is an example of typeahead with a remote data source, like a web API. So you see we have the markup here, which is basically just an input with the class typeahead, and this is purely used for presentation to make it look modern and beautiful. And here's the JavaScript that we need to copy and bring into our project. So copy these. Back in Visual Studio, let's go to our new .cshtml view. So this is our video rental form. Now on the bottom, we add the script section. So section scripts, script tag, and then the standard jQuery initialization. So when document is ready, paste that code here. Now let's go through it line by line. First of all, I'm going to rename best pictures to customers. Now you can see this customers is set to a new Bloodhound object. Bloodhound is the suggestion engine behind type ahead. So it encapsulates all the business logic for auto-completion, such as calling the backend API, caching the result, and so on. Now here we have a property called datum tokenizer, which references a function that takes a datum and transforms it into a bunch of string tokens. So what we have here basically means look at the value property of customers and use white space to tokenize them. These tokens are required by Bloodhound to do its job. Now, how exactly this works, honestly, I don't know. You need to read documentation of Bloodhound or look at its source code. But we need to change this value to name because our customers don't have a property called value. We want to tokenize their name. We also have query tokenizer, which is again a function that transforms query into a bunch of tokens. Next, we have prefetch, which is useful for providing data upon initialization. And this prevents additional requests to the server. Now, in this case, we're not going to use this, so delete. Now, in the remote property, we need to change the URL and set this to /API/customers. So this is our customers API, right? Now, we need to provide a parameter here. Let's call it query and set it to %query. This variable is specified here in the wildcard. And basically, what the user types in the text box will be placed here at runtime. So with this, later we can filter our customers and return those who match the query. Next, we get a reference to our text box. I'm going to change this to an element with the ID customer, which means we should assign this ID to our text box. So further up, here's our text box. So I'm going to give it an ID, customer. Now back in our JavaScript code, the first argument to typeahead method is currently null, but we can pass an object and configure the behavior of typeahead. For example, we can set min length to 3, so typeahead will query the server when the user types at least 3 characters. We can also set highlight to true, so the characters in the search result that match our query will be bold, as you will see shortly. Next, we need to change this name property here to customers. Display specifies what property of our customers we should display in the suggestion list. So again, I'm going to change this to name. And you can see the source of this typeahead plugin is customers, which is our Bloodhound object here. So this is how we set up typeahead. Now let's test this. Build, back to Chrome. You can see our customer text box looks a bit different from our movie text box. And this is because of the styles we have brought from typeahead. Later, we're going to fix this. So for now, don't worry about it. Now let's search for, there you go. So we got auto-completion. And note that in the search result, the first 3 characters of Mary are bold. This is because of highlighting feature that we enabled. Now, one thing we need to add here before we finish this lecture is handling the selection event of typeahead. So when the user selects one of these customers, I want to know what customer it was, so later we can send it to the server. So we can chain the jQuery on method here on. The name of the event is typeahead:select. So if you look at the typeahead's documentation, you see this plugin triggers different kinds of events that you might be interested in. Here we provide a callback function with 2 parameters, E for the event and customer, which is the selected customer. Now at this point, I want to store that customer somewhere. I would like to go on the top and declare an object called VM, which stands for view model, and initialize it to a blank object. So earlier, you learned about view model on the server. We used it to encapsulate data for a given view. Here we have view model on the client. Now in our callback function, when we get this customer, I'm going to set vm.customer_id equals customer.id. So later, when the user submits the form, we're going to send this VM to our web API. And now here's your exercise. I want you to add type-ahead plugin to the movie text box on this page. Handle the selection event, but for now, just display the selection on the console. Don't worry about setting anything in the view model. We'll look at that later. So when the user selects a movie, we want to add this movie to a list because a customer may rent multiple movies. So here in our rental form, first I'm going to create a placeholder for this list. UL with the ID movies and the class list-group. This is another Bootstrap class that we use for creating lists. That's it. Now back in our callback function, here we get the element with the ID movies and append a list item. And here we add the name of the movie and then close the list item. We're modifying the DOM elements directly. Now in this particular example, this is not too bad. But in more complex applications, this may end up being a code smell. That's when we use libraries or frameworks that provide data binding, like Knockout, Angular, React, and so on. So instead of working directly with the DOM, we bind our DOM elements to a model, or more accurately, a view model. The framework itself will take care of refreshing the DOM when the underlying view model changes. And this way, we'll have better separation of concerns because our JavaScript code will not include any HTML markup. Also, unit testing this code will be easier because our code will not be dependent on the availability of a document object model in our unit tests. Now, if all this sounds complicated, don't worry about it. It's beyond the scope of this course, but I just wanted to give you some direction. So back here, when we select a movie, we add this movie to our list. Now, there are a couple more things we need to do before we finish this lecture. First, we need to clear the text box after the selection. So we get the movie text box. Now here we cannot use the jQuery val method to set its value because we have applied the type-ahead plugin on it. So to change the value, we need to use the type-ahead plugin. We call the type-ahead method. As the first argument, we specify the property we want to update, which is val, and here's the value. Second, we want to store this movie in our view model so we can send it to the server later. So I'm going to go on the top. Here's our view model. I'm going to add a property here, movie IDs, and initialize it to an empty array so we can push objects to it. Otherwise, we're going to get an exception. Now, back in our callback function, we set vm.movieIDs.push movie.id. Let's quickly test this. Save, back to the browser, refresh. So here's one movie, here's another. Now we have some aesthetic issues, which is the topic for the next lecture. Okay, let's improve the look and feel of this form. The first thing I want to fix here is these inline text boxes. I want to put them on a separate line. Now let me show you something. Let's inspect this element. So when you apply type-ahead plugin on a text box, this plugin modifies the DOM and adds a few new elements. Look, here we have a span with the class Twitter-typeahead. Inside this span, we have an input with a bunch of styles applied to it. Below this input, we have another input. So this is the input we originally had in the form. Now there are other elements around it. So on the surface, it looks like we have one text box, but the structure is a bit more complicated. Now from the examples on type-ahead website, I noticed that they wrap this text box with another div that has position relative. So I'm going to add a div here, give it a class tt-container, and then move my text box inside this div. I'm going to do the same with the other text box. Div with the class tt-container, tab, and put the input here. Now, I'm going to go to our typeahead.css and add this new class on the bottom, tt-container, and give it position relative. Save. Back to the browser. Refresh. Okay, beautiful. Now, the other issue we have is with our list of movies. So let me add a movie here. They're appearing in bullet points, and that's not what I was looking for. I realized in our JavaScript code in the callback function, I missed a bootstrap class on this list item. Class list-group-item. Save. Back to the browser, refresh. Let's add a movie here. Okay, this is the kind of look and feel I was looking for. The only thing that is bugging me here is the width of these list items. They're taking the entire width of the screen. So I'm going to use Bootstrap grid system to limit the width. Back to our form. Here's our UL. I'm going to add a div with the class row. Inside this div, I'm going to add a div with class call-medium- let's say 4. So Bootstrap divides the screen into 12 columns. 4 here means this column should take about a third of the screen size. And MD represents medium-sized display systems. I don't remember exactly how many pixels, but basically we have small, medium, and large for different kinds of devices, like mobiles, tablets, desktop computers, and so on. Now, because I have changed the resolution of my display for recording purposes, I'm going to apply a second class, call small 4. So on a small device, like my virtual machine here, this is going to be a third of the screen as well. Tab. Okay, here's our structure. Now I'm going to move this UL inside this column. Save. Back to the browser. One more time. Okay, that's better. Okay, now if I type something like, let's say Mary, look, I also see John. So we are not filtering records on the server. Let me show you how to do that. Back in Visual Studio, let's go to Customers Controller. And I'm talking about the API controller. In Get Customers Action, I'm going to add an optional parameter, string query, and set it to null, so it's optional. Our typeahead plugin is going to send that query parameter here. Now, instead of calling toList here, which will immediately execute the query, I'm going to get the result. And at this point, customer details is going to be an iQueryable object. So we can modify this query, apply the filter, and then call toList to execute it. So I'm going to change this to customer query and declare another variable, customer details, and set it to customer query. Actually, it's better to call this customers query. Okay, now we can apply the filter. So if string is null or white space query, I'm going to apply the not operator here. So if we do have a query, we're going to modify our customer's query. Where? Now there are different ways to filter people by name. I'm going to use a simple approach here. So C goes to C.name that contains query. So this way we can dynamically modify the query, then execute it and return the result. Now let's test this. Build. If I type Mary, I only get Mary. And if I type John, I only get John. So now, as an exercise, I want you to apply filtering on the list of movies. You should apply 2 filters, one for the name of the movie and the other to return movies that are available. So go ahead, do this, and in the next video, we'll review my code. Okay, so let's do a quick review. in Movies controller in Get Movies Action, here I've gotten the Movies query. You can see I've applied a where clause here to get only the available movies. And then if our query has a value, we apply that as well. And the rest of this method is exactly like the customer's API. Now we are ready to post a form. So back to our new rental form. First, I'm going to give this form an ID because we're going to use jQuery to get this element. New rental. Now in our JavaScript code, here on the bottom, we get the element with the ID new rental and handle the submit event. This callback function takes a parameter E, which represents the submit event. Now first we need to call e.prevent default. This will prevent the form from submitting normally. If you don't do this, you will have a traditional HTML form. Now instead, you want to use Ajax. So jQuery.ajax. URL is going to be /API/new rentals. Method is going to be post. Alternatively, you could use the jQuery post method instead of Ajax. And data is going to be our view model. So here we've got the customer ID and movie IDs, which looks exactly like our new rental DTO. And finally, we need to handle the success and fail scenarios. So we chain the done method here. And similarly, fail. Now at this point, I'm not going to display notification or clear the form. One step at a time. I just want to make sure that submitting the form works. So I will simply log a message in the console. Save. Now before testing this feature, if you previously called the API and created rental records in the database, you should delete these records because at that point, we didn't have the column in the movies table to keep track of their availabilities. So it's like we rented out some movies, but our number available column is not decreased. So you'll create bad data in your database. So clear this table and then let's test this. Refresh. Mary is going to rent Hangover. I'm going to open up the console. Submit. Done. Beautiful. Next, we're going to add toast notification here. Okay, to add toaster notifications, we're going to use a very popular jQuery plugin called Toaster. So in Package Manager console, install package Toaster. Okay, now we need to go to our bundle config. In the CSS bundle, I'm going to add content/toaster.css. And in our lib bundle, I'm going to add /scripts/toaster.js. Well, back to our form. When we successfully post the form, we're going to use toaster.success to display a message. Rentals successfully recorded. And similarly, in the fail method, we can use toaster.error. Let's say something unexpected happened. Let's test this. Build. Back to the browser. All right, I'm going to fill out the form. There you go. Next, we're going to implement client-side validation. Okay, to add custom validation here, there are a few steps we need to follow. First of all, just to refresh your memory, in bundle config, we have a separate bundle for jQuery validation. Now, potentially we can merge this bundle with our lib bundle if we're going to use this in a lot of different places. But for now, I would rather to keep them separate and include jQuery validation only on pages where we need it. So back here in the script section, we add @scripts.render bundles/jQuery val. Next, we go on top of the form. Here's our customer text box. We can use standard HTML5 validation attributes. Like here, I'm going to add required, and jQuery validation plugin understands this. Now, finally, we need to plug in the validation. Here's where we submit the form. Before this, I'm going to use jQuery to get a reference to our form, new rental, and call the validate method. This plugs in validation into this form. But there is a tiny problem here. With the current implementation, our form will be submitted even if it's not valid. So we need to get the code inside the submit handler and move it inside this validate. So first, we pass an object here. This is the configuration of our validation. Here we set submit handler to a function. If the form is valid, this function will be called to submit the form to the server. Now we get the code inside our submit handler, cut, and paste it here. And then delete this. Save, back to Chrome, refresh. Look, we got the validation message here. Now let's make this red. So right click, inspect. So you see it's a label with the class error. So back in Visual Studio, I'm going to go to site.css. Earlier in the course, we defined this class field validation error, which is applied to the error messages next to input fields. Now I'm going to add label.error here as well. And similarly, I'm going to add input.error here. So the invalid fields will have a red border. Save, back to the browser. There you go. So this is the basic of validation, but something is missing here. If I type ABC here, the validation message disappears, but this is not a valid customer. We should enforce the user to select a valid customer from the list. So to handle this, we need a custom validator. Back to our form. Before calling the validate method, I'm going to create a custom validator. So jQuery.validator.add method. We give this a name, valid customer. And here's our validation function that jQuery will call. Now here, I want to make sure that our view model has a property called customer ID, and this customer ID has a numeric value that is not 0. So return vm.customerID, and vm.customerID is not 0. Just basic JavaScript. Now here, optionally, we can specify an error message, like please select a valid customer. Now to apply this, we go back to our customer text box, apply a data attribute, data-rule-valid customer, and we set that to true. So jQuery validation plugin looks for custom attributes that start with data-rule. Save. Let's test this. Look, I got the error, but if I select Mary, the error disappears. Now here's your exercise. You want to enforce the user to select at least one movie. So create a custom validator and plug this into the form. In the next lecture, we'll review my code. Okay, here's the custom validator I have implemented. So I called it at least one movie, and the implementation is very basic. We just check the length of the movie IDs array, and if it's greater than 0, that means we have at least one movie in this array. Now I noticed a couple of bugs in my code. One is this E here. I moved this code from our previous submit handler, and this E was the submit event. But we don't have this argument and this function. Now, even if I add this here, it still doesn't work. Because when jQuery validation plugin calls this function, it passes a reference to the form, not the submit event. So in order to prevent the form from being submitted normally, we're going to use a different technique. We're going to return false at the end of this function. So when submit handler is called, we immediately use Ajax to call the server and then return false. And this will prevent the form from being submitted normally. Also, another issue I discovered was that sometimes the validation messages didn't appear when I clicked the submit button. Now, I don't know how magically they worked in the last video, but in case you have had the same problem on your machine, the reason is we forgot to assign the name attribute to our input fields. So here, name equals customer. jQuery validation plugin relies on this attribute to do its job. Similarly, name is movie. So we're done with the implementation of our client-side code, but let's take a look at our JavaScript code. We have a fair amount of JavaScript code, and currently there is no structure. We have dumped all the code inside document.ready function. And while this is not terribly bad, but code like this can become smelly sooner or later. So there are a few techniques we can refactor this code and modularize it. And that's something I'm going to talk about in the second part of this course. I will show you how to refactor existing code to improve separation of concerns and maintainability. Currently, the issue we have is not only on the front end. As an example, look at this action we created in new rentals controller. This is what we call a fat action. It's hardly fitting on one page. So in the next part, I will show you how to refactor this code into an object-oriented design where every object has a clear responsibility. This way, you will not end up with fat methods, whether on the server or on the client. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. When we successfully record rentals, we need to clear the form. So we get the customer input field and use type ahead to clear its value. And similarly for the movie text box. And for the list of movies, we use the empty method to clear its list items. So these three lines will clear the form. But we also have to reset our view model. So VM equals a new object, and we need to initialize its movie IDs to an empty array. And finally, we need to reset the state of the form in terms of its validation. So this validate method returns a validator object, validator. You can get that, and here call validator dot reset form. So this will reset the form in terms of its validation. Let's quickly recap the approach I've used to build this feature systematically. First of all, we focus on the problem. Make sure you understand what problem you're trying to solve. Otherwise, you're going to waste your time and energy writing useless code that doesn't provide value. As part of understanding the problem, focus on the core of the problem and get rid of all the distractions. Remember this building? We want to focus on the structure, not the windows or PowerPoints. Once you understand the essence of the problem and the key players in it, start from the backend, because this way you won't get distracted by complex UI or usability best practices. Think of the inputs and the output of the use case you're working on. This will help you build an API for this use case. Once you declare your API, look at the existing domain model implementation. Can the current implementation fulfill this use case? If yes, great. If not, modify and use code-first migrations to bring your database up to date. Then add the simplest implementation in your API. Just think of the happy path. Imagine all the inputs are valid. Focus on solving the core problem. Once you build the happy path, test it. Make sure it's working. Then think of edge cases, one by one. Don't try to do too many things at once. So gradually extend your implementation to support edge cases and validation. Once you're done with your backend, move on to the front end. And all these concepts apply in the front end as well. So get rid of all the little details and focus on building the simplest user interface that works. Then gradually add little details, one at a time. But this approach, I can promise you can solve most, if not all, problems out there. Now, in the next section, we're going to look at deployment and wrap up the course.